Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Fire These Times. My name is Elia Ayoub, and I'll be your host today. Joining me today is Justin Salhani, a repeated guest, as well as a occasional guest host of the Fire These Times. And we'll be talking about a topic that concerns the both of us, that we feel doesn't get enough coverage due to the nature of Lebanon doesn't get much coverage in general, which is a recent spike in violence. We'll get into it obviously more in detail. A recent spike in violence against Syrian refugees, largely by members of what we can only describe as like right-wing Christians, far-right Christians, fascist Christians in many ways, loosely affiliated with one of the dominant political parties, the Lebanese Forces, and a few other smaller ones. And we'll talk about like what happened, why is it a big deal, and how we think it might escalate or not, and like basically what we think can come out of this. But before starting, as usual, thank you for listening to this episode of the Fire These Times. And if you'd like to support us, please head out to patreon.com/FireThesTimes. And if you do so, you'll get early access to all episodes, not just of this podcast, but of Politically Depressed, Khida, as well as Obscuristan. You would get exclusive premium episodes of all four podcasts, as well as access to our monthly hangout, book club, merchandise, and more. We're always experimenting with things to do and, figuring out our capacities and stuff like that. So obviously, the more we grow, the better it gets. So anyway, without further ado, Justin, let's start with some basic intros, if that's okay. First, of course, introduce yourself and talk to us about the topic. Introduce the topic, let's say.
So I'm a journalist and writer based between Beirut and Paris. I've predominantly been in Beirut since September due to, the regional situation unfolding post Tufan al-Aqsa, October 7. What we're seeing today is the culmination of or what we're seeing in Lebanon with this particular episode the issue that we're focusing on is the culmination of a number of things that have happened and a number of campaigns that have kind of taken place over the course of months. There's been a massive surge in anti-Syrian sentiment, largely driven by certain political leaders, what we won't call state media, but politically affiliated media, which is the predominantly mainstream media in Lebanon, and the publicization of, let's say, a number of crimes that have happened. So what essentially is happening is that people are seeing a pattern in crimes happening, being committed by people who tend to be of Syrian nationality because of the way that they're publicized, because of the way that they're being spoken about, and because of the way they're being scapegoated for a number of things that have been happening in the country. As many people may know, Lebanon is going through a severe economic crisis for the last 5 years. There was kind of what many people might call a failed revolution, but revolutions are ongoing in a lot of ways. But in October 2019, people in Lebanon rose up against the government. COVID happened and took a lot of the steam out of that, as well as a number of other things. As the economic crisis got worse. 2020, we had the Beirut port explosion, and so over the years, as the situation has deteriorated, political corruption has been a major thing. The banks, as frustration has grown, as people have grown tired, many politicians in particular have looked for scapegoats, and they've turned that ire on Syrians in particular. I think that's the best way to kind of sum it up. And Joey, maybe we can start talking about the latest few days, which was kind of kicked off by one particular incident, with a bit of the background and the campaigns in particular that have happened over the last few weeks that have led to what we've seen lately, the videos that we've seen lately come out on social media and other places.
We're recording this on April 13, 2024. A few days ago, a member of the Lebanese Forces, or the Uwait as we call them in Arabic, was killed, Pascal Sleiman, and his body was taken to Syria. I'll let you give a bit of that background just so we are clear on the facts. And of course, then we'll talk about the wider narratives around exactly what happened, and more importantly, kind of the reactions to all of that.
Sure. I think it's notable to also announce that today is the 49th anniversary of the start of the Lebanese Civil War. So a bit of a dark, I guess,
I literally did not even think about it. We'll get into it, actually. There's an unfortunately interesting parallels and stuff. But yeah, incredible. I didn't even think about it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Well, with everything going on, I think it's easy to kind of slip into different spaces. So one thing I think it's important to know is that prior to this latest incident, there's been particular campaigns. One particular campaign that hit the media was something, you'll see billboards across Lebanon with something called Undo the Damage. Nobody seems to be completely sure who's behind it, but there are a number of, I guess, organizations on there, including MTV, which is a very prominent media outlet. There's an NGO called World House of Lebanon, and the Chamber of Commerce, Industry, and Agriculture. And so they're kind of pushing these sort of anti-refugee, anti-Syrian narratives. And you'll have a number of other politicians kind of jumping on board, including the Minister of Interior, including Gibran Bassil, who's has held many different portfolios over there and leads one of the major Christian parties as well. When I arrived in September, there was a real palpable feel in certain neighborhoods of strong, violent, visceral resentment against refugees, against Syrians in particular. So this all led up to, and last year we went through a series of deportations with the army as well, where they had set up checkpoints at different points, and they were criticized by human rights groups for taking Syrians and sending them back to Syria, which has been proven not to be a safe place, especially for many people for various reasons. But this, just to keep this idea, the resentment and the actual danger to Syrians has kind of ebbed and flows at different times. There's a consistent level of danger, but there's been times where the focus has been extremely intense and times where it seems like, people could relatively kind of carry on with their lives. So we got to a boiling point in the past week. There were a couple of incidents that were highly publicized in the media, including that a Syrian domestic worker was accused of helping a couple of her, co-nationals break into a house and rob and kill a disabled man. And that got a lot of publicity. You could say that a lot of incidents involving Syrians get heavy publicity, whereas regular crimes or other crimes don't get the same publicity. So it leads to this sort of environment. And then what happened on April 7th was a member of the right-wing Christian party called the Lebanese Forces. The story that's come out from the army is that there was an attempted carjacking. Apparently a gang, and then once this news became public, it was announced by the Lebanese army that it was a Syrian gang, attempted to steal the car, ended up killing the man, and then took his body to Syria. A bunch of conspiracies immediately emerged where people started to spread rumors that the car wasn't even taken, that the body was taken, and that proves that it's a political killing versus a faulty carjacking. Apparently, at least according to local media reports, the car was taken to Syria. It was not left behind. One of the cars that they used to rob or to carjack, the car that they had been in while attempting the carjack, was then left near Tripoli in the north, but the car was taken across, and then the Lebanese security forces worked with the Syrian security forces and worked to get the body to come back. The area that they went into was Homs, which is an area that supposedly controlled by Hezbollah. So there's a lot we don't know about this incident in particular. Was it politically motivated or not? Was it was it genuinely an attempted carjacking? What was everything going on around it? The Lebanese forces have said that they will treat it as a political killing until otherwise. But the fallout that we saw from that turned into a lashing out against Syrian refugees first, predominantly and almost exclusively at this point. Suddenly videos started to go viral, one in particular from a pretty working class neighborhood called Bush Hamoud, where there's a heavy, not just Syrian presence, but quite an international presence of guys in black shirts going around announcing that Syrians have until Fridays to close their shops, to move out of their houses, and to leave the areas. April 12th. A number of other notifications were posted around different municipalities, all predominantly or majority Christian areas. Again, a lot of these statements were identical and had just kind of seemed to have just changed the name of the municipality. So and it doesn't seem to have been politically organized. While the immediate response, so on April 7th, which I believe was a Sunday, the immediate response in the next day or two, when this incident hit the media, videos started to emerge of mostly men in black shirts affiliated with groups like the Lebanese forces or non-affiliated, were hitting the street and basically filming themselves beating up essentially predominantly working class Syrians. There was reports of them attacking cars with Syrian license plates. I heard from a few researchers, Syrian researchers or researchers who work on the Syrian issue in Lebanon, that soon after the Lebanese forces did put out a note to its followers to calm down, to stop attacking people, that this is not the way they want to do things, that there's a rule of law, and that they've been very adamant on doing that, on mobilizing their people to try to spread calm. But there's still this threat of expulsion, and then the state at times has coordinated with these groups, or at least held the same sort of, I guess we could say, work towards the same means. The Lebanese intelligence has set up a number of checkpoints. I happened to walk by one yesterday while I was visiting a few people in a predominantly Christian area. And this is all to say that essentially Syrians in Lebanon who are and I want to be very clear here. These are working class people, because people who tend to be kind of middle or upper class, who can pass or have been here long enough that they can maybe speak with a Lebanese accent. I've heard from different people that they've figured out ways to kind of navigate, or to kind of go, under the radar a bit. They won't attract the same sort of attention or even aggression. But so a lot of Syrians have supposedly left their areas or have just stayed home. There have been reports of people knocking on doors or going door to door. And this is something that is not new either. This is something that has happened in the past, where sometimes it was individuals, again, like what we can call them sort of black shirts here. And these black shirts are spread the spectrum of groups of funders. And it's something that I think, we'll need more work to look into who's behind them, how popular and mobilized is this, how organized is this. But I've heard stories essentially from different sources about sometimes security forces and black shirts kind of working together to at times evict or harass, different people, typically people in the Syrian community. So that's what we're seeing at the moment. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of tension. Again, this right-wing political group, Lebanese Forces, who has contributed to so much of this anti-Syrian sentiment, has called for calm, thankfully. That has really eased, let's say, like public tension, but I think the individual tension in terms of how the families are feeling, or the communal tension of how the families are feeling, is incredibly stressed. There's a lot of insecurity. A lot of people aren't sure what to do, where to go, if they can move around. So I've rambled for long enough now, but that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, that's the thing as well, is like they called for calm now, and that's obviously good. But ultimately, right now, any Syrian in Lebanon knows that they're under threat. I mean, in one way or another. Obviously, as you said, that there are layers to that, and it's a very sad fact. But if you're a Syrian of certain means or a certain background, and even like if you are able to speak English or French, you're safer than if you were speaking Syrian Arabic. Which is the dialect of the same Levantine Arabic that Lebanese Arabic is part of. But that's just the situation it is. I have a good friend of mine. I'm not gonna say too much details, but like she's of Syrian Christian origins basically, and she got 2 knocks on her doors the other day, living somewhere in Beirut. And after she said that she's Assyrian, she said that she could even see like the sense of relief in the people who knocked on her door, because they wanted to know like who she is, where she's from, and all of that stuff. And that's sort of the situation in many ways. It plays, if I want to put like this academic hat on and try and be a bit dispassionate about it, because otherwise I get really angry all the time on this topic. It plays into a lot of like interesting intersections in the sense of like Lebanese history and Lebanese identity. For example, if you're a Syrian with a Western passport, you're safer than if you're a Syrian, obviously, who is quote unquote just a refugee. And in fact, having that status as refugee puts you in a different category in the Lebanese political system than being a citizen of a foreign nation, or being a Syrian who might be a Syrian citizen, like a citizen of the Syrian state, but of middle class or upper class origins, including some of those who were given the Lebanese nationality not that long ago by none other than Gibran Bassil, the person we're talking about now. So there's a lot of like these layers of who gets access to not just citizenship, which is a very specific thing, but who gets access to security. And this has a long history in Lebanon, specifically towards refugees. Lebanon, I would describe it as structurally extremely hostile to refugees in terms of like its political system, not in terms of like individuals necessarily. That varies obviously from people to people. But my own personal background, the only reason in many ways, the only reason I exist, but the reason I have the Lebanese citizenship is because my grandfather was granted the Lebanese citizenship. And that was because he came from a certain background as a Palestinian. He was a Christian, and therefore was given the nationality in the 50s. And so there are all these layers and echoes and whatnot of what's happening now, because of course, we talk, as I said, 50s. The rhetoric and the kind of the wider discourse and narrative against or around Syrian refugees in many ways is a recycled one that was already used, tried and tested against Palestinian refugees in the past. And the only reason it's sort of like they're not much of focus in the Palestinian refugees, I mean, is because, well, Syria is more of a quote-unquote hot topic for the Lebanese political system right now. It brings up questions regarding Hezbollah, which is a politically sensitive topic in many ways, and a good politically sensitive topic for a group like the Lebanese Forces, which views itself as an opponent to Hezbollah, and in many ways the main Christian alternative to what was a dominant Christian party, the Free Patriotic Movement, led by Gibran Bassil, as we mentioned before, which is like allied nominally to Hezbollah. So you have all of those layers happening at the same time as, of course, the war in southern Lebanon, which brings up other interesting, if not grim, questions, many of which you've explored yourself in an episode on this podcast a few weeks ago. People should check it out. There is, I think, Southern Lebanon in the title. It shouldn't be difficult to find. But like, okay, so where do we go from here? We saw a lot of the immediate aftermath after the news of his death, his murder, Suleiman's murder, came out. You had a number of the very, to my mind, familiar rhetoric coming out. I should say, and this is important for context, I come from that community. I grew up in a Lebanese Christian household. The neighborhood was like 99% Christian, and my entire school was basically 99% Christian. And that was virtually my entire life until the age of like 16, 17 or so. And overwhelmingly, those were people who I would describe now that I know how these words work as right-wing. Very conservative in many ways, but politically right-wing as well, not just like they hold weird views or whatever. And there's always been this sense within the Christian community, at least for like as far back as I can go in terms of reading my own history, this sense of like being quote unquote under threat, right? Like being like, oh, we are the minority, even though we don't kind of say that, and numerically we are, of course, but we don't say it because historically we weren't, and politically Christians have a disproportionate amount of power in Lebanon compared to their actual numbers, and that's kind of one of the, not so much of a secret, but like often an open secret that even many Muslim politicians are happy to go with because they feel it makes them look good as well, like tolerant and secular and all of that stuff. And the sense of like we are under threat was like, it goes back to like one of the origins of the Lebanese civil war. You mentioned as it happens today is April 13th, the start of the 75 civil war with the bus massacre against Palestinian refugees. And so the parallels here are a bit haunting. We don't have a bus massacre, thankfully, and hopefully we never would get one. But it's not difficult to imagine the conditions that can lead to one. And in many ways, the conditions are already here. You know, in many ways, we don't need to create them. We don't need to wait for things to get worse because in many ways they are as bad as it can get in many areas of Lebanon already. And there's enough political will, I suppose, by a lot of people, maybe not necessarily the leadership, which wants to play things in a quote unquote cleaner way because they want to say, Lebanese forces want to say that, you know, they're on the side of the state and the rule of law, as you say, and whatnot. What they want is mass deportation that's done by the state. They don't want random people on the streets doing it for them because they understandably know that it doesn't look good. So all of these layers, right? Like we'll even see how much we can get into because it's just it's a minefield of different complicated topics. But I'll let you kind of reflect on that a bit because I kind of threw a lot at you, and we'll see how to organize it properly. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think like maybe an overlining thought I'd like to put forward is that, you know, I mean, Joey, as you know very well, in Lebanon, historically, we don't really have justice. There is no truth and there is no reconciliation. We never had that post-war. And for a lot of major issues, we don't get that. I think that seeps through, and that seeps through in a couple of ways. One is that because we don't have those on major issues, people apply their own lens to everything. And that's why, you know, everyone's taken this Pascal Sleiman thing and applied it in their own way. The LF will say that, you know, this is another example of Hezbollah assassinating, you know, figures, whether it's related to August 4th blast, because it's also notable to note that Pascal Sleiman was I think an IT director at I believe it's Byblos Bank, which is one of the major Lebanese banks. So, I mean, that kind of fits into the whole framework of that. And then other communities or other political movements will also apply to this what they want, you know, and everyone seems to do that because they've never had a sense of justice. But then what they also do is they kind of project the fact that there's no justice on these major issues to more minor issues too. And you'll hear people say, you know, we don't have a state, we don't have any security, we don't have anything, even though actually, and I don't think that, you know, I don't want to say that, you know, paint a picture as though Lebanon is a very secure country in a lot of ways, but many people who commit crimes that are not politically affiliated are arrested. They do face some form of justice, and we can, this is not the time to go into the Lebanese justice system, but Syrians have been arrested quite a bit, whether it's for crimes they have committed or not. And even in this exact crime, and which was a really terrible crime, and this guy left behind a small family, and regardless of his politics, like he absolutely did not deserve to die, right? Like he did not deserve to go through what he went through here by any means, and it's a horrible crime. They arrested 7 Syrians, and the army immediately announced that it was a Syrian gang that took him. And I think there was a calculated effort, at least from people that I've spoken to, for them to say that. They said that this was a Syrian gang, almost in a way of diffusing what might have been political tension in Lebanon to be kind of a way to take it out on the refugee community. Now, there are some parallels here. I mean, again, like we're talking, it's a bit ironic that we're talking about this on the anniversary of the Lebanese Civil War, because there's 2 threads, and there's 2 things that I'll address here. You mentioned that there's this perception of the Christians as maybe not saying it explicitly, but recognizing that they are a minority. Their percentage wise, they've their presence in Lebanon percentage wise has decreased since the foundation of the country. And I think that that perception is even stronger because before it was Greater Lebanon, that number was or that percentage was even much higher, right? And so that is included into the wider story, which gives this perception of like a mass decrease. There's also the thing that post-war, the powers of the Lebanese president were diminished somewhat to give more of a balance. And I think it's important to note that perception, because you'll hear a lot of people say now, oh, the president doesn't do anything. Now, the president doesn't have nearly as much power as that he might have had pre-war, but there still are some responsibilities and there's still some certain impact that he can, and I mean, it's always been a he, right, can impact on the country.
And we should say just at this juncture, Justin, this is relevant because Lebanon has a political sectarian system in which the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament has to be a Shia Muslim, and then various other high-ranking positions are also spread out along those sectarian lines. So before the civil war, before 75, the Lebanese president, i.e. the Christians in that sense, had more power. And after the civil war, it's not so much that they became less powerful, although relatively speaking, yes, but it kind of was balanced out more along that sectarian logic. So that's why this is a relevant, something that happened in the 90s specifically. And more importantly, given the sensitivity of what we're talking of, like violence against Syrian refugees, this happened during the Syrian occupation. So this happened during the occupation by the Syrian army under Hafez al-Assad, which would continue until 2005 under his son Bashar, and then the Syrian revolution, all of that kicked out the Syrian army from Lebanon. And so in many people's minds, especially Christians, I would say conservative, right-wing, maybe of a certain generation here, I'm kind of generalizing a bit, have that association that Syrians equals Syrian regime. Even if it's not explicit, even if it's not like said so out loud, and even though logically it makes no sense because those are refugees that largely fled the Syrian regime, but that's part of the associations, part of the complexity of this picture.
Yeah, and it's part of the trauma, right? Because that negative feeling will still exist, and you'll have people tell you. Many of them will say, I'm against these actions. I'm against vigilante justice. I'm against attacking poor people who are just working. But I don't feel that much sympathy personally. Or when you get into more personal conversations, people tell you they have this trauma, and I think it's important that we we confront this trauma, that we understand this trauma without excusing physical attacks against people, many of whom have also opposed the same regime who at one time oppressed, the Lebanese people. I think it's important, maybe we also make the distinction, when we say the Christians, historically, it tends to be more Maronites that have dominated that space. There are many different Christian sects in Lebanon. The Maronites are the most populous and the most powerful. And then different groups have, they are not exclusively on one side, but there tends to be this and it gets a bit messy, and maybe it's not the time to get too into it, but there tends to be this speaking on behalf of the Christians, though there may be a lot of Lebanese Christians. I mean, even within the Maronites, there's a huge spectrum, and a lot of Lebanese Christians were also involved in Arab nationalist movements and in other, political programs and political movements over time. but they have the right wing has kind of dominated this narrative of speaking on behalf of the Christians, which I think is important to point out. There's one more thing that I do want to say here, which is that looking at the parallels between the start of the war from the Christian perspective, the start of the civil war from the Christian perspective, and today, at the time, the PLO was in Lebanon, they had an armed presence. I think that from the Christian perspective today, if we again using this, in broad quotes, the Christian perspective today, there's this idea that there's been this perception built up, and that a lot of this is coming through again these media campaigns and these political statements, that there is a sort of threat. Now, it can be kind of a demographic threat in their mind, but there's also the threat of crime. Crime is a central thing. They talk about them committing crimes, and I think this goes back to what why somebody with a Western passport or somebody who can kind of dress a bit nicer, let's say, can pass, whereas the targeting was really at working class. There was a very clear class dynamic in terms of who was being targeted. And I think a lot of that comes through this feeling, this fear of, lower class people committing crimes in their mind. And that, in the forming of gangs and such, there's almost this callback to, in their mind, a mobilization of Syrians in a certain way. And when you hear the language being used in these spaces, a lot of times they don't talk about, yeah, there's a Syrian who did this, or there's a Syrian who did this. There's the talk of like a wider conspiracy of a mobilization in a way. And they don't always necessarily have answers to who's behind it or whatnot. But I think there's a genuine feeling of fear. There's a genuine sense, like, let's be clear here. There is a sense of machismo and punishment and wanting to enact violence on somebody weaker than yourself. But I think there's also layers of that, and there are layers of people who are, because of the atmosphere, because of the environment that has been created again by the media campaigns and the political statements and the community around them. And oftentimes we can say a lack of contact with, people in these communities. There is a genuine feeling of fear and concern. One last thing I'll say, I guess, on this is that, I'm staying in an area right now that is there's a very big Syrian presence. There's a lot of Syrian from all classes, really. I'm in a Beirut neighborhood, and we've not seen any, I won't pretend for a minute that there's not any racism, that there's not any side comments, there's not, anything of that nature. But we haven't seen anything of this nature in terms of like public expulsions, statements, anything like that. And there's a theory called contact theory, where essentially in areas where people tend to come in contact more with people from different communities, the way that they interact is more humane and more nuanced. And in areas where, the relationships and the contact is less frequent, that's when you have these more of like rejectionist perspectives. And this is a theory that I first spoke to German researchers in 2015 when Syrians were moving to Germany. The areas where refugees were being housed and received and where people were meeting them were a lot more open and accommodating, whereas the areas that were way more fearful, rejectionist, tended to be the areas where there wasn't much of an immigrant presence at all. And I think whereby all these areas that are being listed, there are refugees there, there are Syrians there. I think that there, in these incidents, we've seen different dynamics play out in this way. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm going to let that go.
No. This is actually, I mean, what you mentioned in contact theory is it's true across the world, right? We know from when I was in the UK, like the Brexit stuff, the areas that had fewer immigrants were more anti-immigrant. It's just one of those things that, like, it's easier to talk about a group of people in generalizing terms, often negative terms, if you don't know many individuals that are part of that community. If you, it's one thing to be able to say that in the abstract, and it's another thing to say it and have actual names and faces in mind. And it's the same in Lebanon, of course. There's nothing special about the Lebanese case in that sense. I think what kind of makes it, at least in this current context, very dangerous is because we mentioned that there hasn't been any truth and reconciliation from the civil war, and that's of course true. And in fact, in many ways, the war crimes were rewarded. The people who were the warlords and various oligarchs during the war, for the most part, are the ones that ended up becoming the politicians in the post-war. Samir Jarja, the leader of Lebanese forces, is one of them. Michel Aoun, one of the leaders of the Free Patriotic Movement, the father-in-law of Gibran Bassil, is another one of them, and so on and so forth. As I said, like, what makes it very difficult in this case is that in the same way as you didn't have a truth and reconciliation of the civil war, one of the consequences of that is that effectively, as of the 90s, when the civil war officially ended, there was a de facto political consensus in Lebanon, and that's not often talked about, but it is well researched within Lebanese studies, of essentially blaming the Palestinians. So the Palestinians would be the ones to be blamed for the start of the Lebanese civil war due to the presence of the PLO and the activities of the PLO and so on and so forth. And often just Arafat himself, like just him personally, Arafat himself was like blamed for everything. The details here don't matter because what matters is the story. And so the story ended up being that this was a war of others on Lebanese lands. This was Ghassan Twaini, for example, one of his books, The War of Others or something along those lines. Harb al-Akharin, actually, that is the name of the book. And so that narrative of the fact that Lebanon and the Lebanese, when these conflicts erupt, are sort of like Lebanon is sort of almost an innocent bystander. And the Lebanese are sort of like almost just caught in the middle. And so the difference here, of course, is not the PLO, it's Hezbollah in that narrative, the equivalent of today. And Hezbollah, of course, is a Lebanese group. But you can be of a certain political tendency in Lebanon, let's say a Lebanese forces supporter, and as I said, I grew up among many of them, who will not see Hezbollah as a Lebanese political party. They view Hezbollah as a foreign plant, as at the very least a party that sure has Lebanese citizens, but is effectively an Iranian party in Lebanon. And as with all of these things, there is always a kernel of truth in everything. All of these conspiracy theories, you always have like a percentage of that which is technically accurate. Like if they want to believe that Hezbollah assassinated Pascal Sleiman by saying, well, Hezbollah has killed many people before. Yes, Hezbollah has killed many people before. So you need that kernel of truth in order to surround it with a wider discourse. Otherwise, it's more difficult to do so. And same for the accusation that or the claim, if you want, that the argument that Hezbollah is not a Lebanese party. Well, it is a Lebanese party. It is true that it was founded by the Iranian state, at least heavily funded and armed and ideologically as well founded by the Iranian state after 1979. And it is true that they heavily depend on Iran. It is not true, however, that they are just another Iranian plant in Lebanon, because they're not. They're a Lebanese political party with various calculations. Some have to do with Iran, others don't. And that's what makes it very complicated as a party, of course. And so, but if you don't want to engage with that, and if you already have 1,000 reasons, many of which can be valid, to really hate that party, Hezbollah in this case, it's easy to see them as part of a wider conspiracy because Hezbollah is outside of Lebanon. It is in Syria, especially in Iraq to a lesser extent, and of course in Iran. So it does get involved in these geopolitical questions, which also touch on this other sensitive, if at least complicated, question of Lebanese isolationism, of like trying to be quote unquote neutral, not to get involved with where when it comes to Israel, Palestine, or when it comes to Syria, and so on and so forth. So there are all of these tendencies kind of playing out at the same time. And you can easily see how in a population, especially within the Christian one in this case, but honestly, this tendency is not just a Christian one, it just takes a very specific format among Christians. And I think a one that's more likely to be violent against refugees specifically, due to everything we've been talking about. It's easier in a population already has a lot of conspiracy thinking. That's already something that's very common in Lebanon, broadly speaking. For these kind of threads to be taken in different directions, especially if you have the media institutions and the political parties that dominate a lot of those media institutions, as we mentioned, MTV is a notorious one, OTV is another one, and so on and so forth, that are pushing these narratives, whether directly or indirectly, and sort of left for the individual in many ways. And this then brings up questions of resources and class and education and all of that, to pass through all of these things and form have an informed opinion come out of it, which of course is very difficult. I hope this is clear with listeners. I have this assumption that people who listen to this podcast already know that I'm against all of this shit, but I wanted it to be very clear. Although I'm saying that, I come from that community in the sense of this is my background. I'm just describing something as a fact. I have rejected that a very long time ago, and in many ways have been shunned by a number of those community leaders a long time ago. I'm mentioning this specifically because what I'm saying is that it's very familiar to me, and it's something that as I ended up then doing my PhD roughly on this topic in one way or another, at least indirectly so, the parallels to the causes of the civil war, or what led to the civil war, and more importantly, the lack of truth and reconciliation, as well, the lack of healing after the civil war, as of the 90s and so on. I'm saying civil war, usually I say Lebanese wars in the plural because there were many of them. The lack of healing, the co-occupation by the Syrians and the Israelis in the 90s up until 2000 and then 2005 and so on, respectively. Well, no, not respectively, the opposite. All of those questions, all of those traumas in many ways are just there. They're just sitting right now within the Lebanese population, within the population broadly speaking. And of course, right now we have a war in southern Lebanon where Hezbollah is involved, Israel is bombing, while committing a genocide in Gaza, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the people who are so focused on the Syrian refugees right now don't say as much about Palestinians because it's not politically viable to do so. All of these things, like I'm barely scratching the surface. It's incredible how such a small country can have so much to talk about. Anyway, I'm gonna stop on this. I have a few other points I wanted to make, but I'll let you reflect on that as well. I hope listeners can get a sense from the way we're even talking. It's not that we were not prepared. We actually have like a shit ton of bullet points we want to go through, but every one of them can lead to like different branches that are actually quite mind-boggling. But yeah,
that's an important point because I'm trying to like really focus on the important here, and I think it can get so minute, so baseball that it's I think the point that you make, like for example, if you go around parts of Beirut, you'll see graffiti where it says Iran out. There is really that mentality, and it's kind of I think the relationship with Iran and Hezbollah is obviously one. They speak very fondly of each other. They're very close, but it's a bit funny, and I don't want to say it's apples to apples, but before the Lebanese civil war, the Lebanese forces, or the Lebanese wars, as you correctly stated, the Lebanese forces, if I'm not mistaken, were receiving money at different times from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were, an anti-communist party, as like leftist movements were gaining ground in Lebanon and the wider region. And actually today as well, Saudi Arabia has returned and started to fund the Lebanese forces again. So they do, allegedly take money from outside players in a way. And again, the relationship is different, but I think that's interesting to say. Now, when you talk to a lot of their supporters, they'll say you'll hear a theme kind of come through, and this is not exclusively the Lebanese forces. This is anywhere on the kind of Christian right. They'll say something like, Syria and Palestine and all these other places were involved in Lebanon, and all we ever wanted was Lebanon. There's this extension, there's this idea that, yes, there are, like you mentioned, Hezbollah has Lebanese members, Lebanese passport holders, but the people who are the guardians of Lebanon, the people who truly care about Lebanon historically, in their mind is them. And in a sense, they are the state and the state is them. And I think a big reason for that is because, whenever they acted outside of the state, as Christian militias formed, and this was a big reason why the country devolved in the civil war in the 70s, was the presence of all these militias. But they still felt in a way that they were acting on behalf of this idea of Lebanon and this idea of the state. And I think that's because it not only served them as a community, it often, I think it's fair to say, it favored them. You pointed out before that the president was always a Maronite Christian, and before the war, before the series of wars, and when the quote unquote civil war ended in 1990, that power was slightly taken away. But you still have the commander in chief of the Lebanese armed forces is a Maronite. Up until recently, the head of the Lebanese bank was a Maronite, and in all these different institutions, you constantly found figures that would favor that, and different actors that would work in a way that would at times favor this community. So part of this clash came at a time where people were trying to redraw the lines of power in the state, whether that was trying to turn it into more of a secular state or just try to bring about a different reality within the state. And so I think that history of, when a state serves you, feeling connected to it and then feeling that you have the right to act on behalf of it, even if you go through out of state means, which ironically is something that, whether they truly believe this or not, is something that Hezbollah does quite frequently and are criticized quite frequently about. Hassan Nasrallah will say, we're doing these things for Lebanon. And then you have many other Lebanese will say, well, please don't speak on my behalf because I don't agree with your actions. I think that, historically, that's been quite the same thing. So it's made this community at times believe that they are the state and the state is them. So if they take an action, even if it's not a state ordained action, they are acting on behalf of this, idea called Lebanon.
Yeah, and this idea was prominent even when they were acting against the state. Even when during the Lebanese wars, they were taking arms against the Lebanese state and the Lebanese armed forces. They were doing by saying, well, the state is compromised. It's it's all run by Syrians and whatever it might be, and therefore we are the correct whatnot. It's important to note here, and here we'll slowly kind of wrap up, or at least try as much as we can, and talk about like what we think might come next, because that's kind of the big question here. But there's this notion, people need to know this. It's something that's not talked about, I think, outside of very small circles as much. Like we know, or at least most people, when they think of the term muqawama, resistance, in the context of Lebanon, they think of Hezbollah as a party and movement. And that's because for various reasons, that party has ended up becoming the hegemonic power within that movement. Partly, not always, due to the fact that they were actually killing the other members of the resistance at the time, the communists notably. But anyway, so they call themselves the Muqawam Islamiyya, the Islamist Muqawam, the Islamist resistance specifically. But there's another party, the Lebanese forces, that has also always called itself the Muqawama, al-Muqawama al-Lebaniyya, the Lebanese resistance. So when I growing up, it was really common for me to see like posters and pamphlets and billboards and whatnot of that term, al-Muqawama al-Lebaniyya, either because they're commemorating the assassination of someone, often, for example, Bashir Gemayel, the president of Lebanon in 1982, was assassinated, and so on and so forth, or others, warlords and various other nasty figures, commemorating them under that term. Like they were the shuhada, they were the martyrs of the Lebanese cause. Now, anyone who knows anything about Hezbollah would, of course, see parallels there. That Hezbollah has a lot of martyrs. They also would say for Lebanon. They might say also like for various Islamic causes, but in their minds, those two are not separate. And of course, in the Lebanese forces side of things, it's basically that. I mean, I'm simplifying a bit, but it's similar enough, except that it's the Christian version. And because it's a Christian version, it takes on a different vocabulary, one which I think today, due to various historical reasons, can sound more Western friendly, quote unquote, than the Hezbollah equivalent. Although in actuality, in many ways, they share a lot of similarities. Heavily patriarchal, heavily right-wing, even economically, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, all of that stuff is basically a given. And xenophobic and nationalistic. That's the irony of sectarianism in Lebanon, is that it's a sectarianism that's Lebanese. It's a sectarianism that operates under Lebanese nationalist logic. It is a sectarianism that can be extended in many ways to include communities, let's say Christians who are Syrians or Iraqis, because they can say, well, you're victims of the same great plot of replacement or whatever, and so therefore we will be nice to you or whatever it might be. But there is that angle. I almost hesitated to bring this up because it's going to be such a minefield in of itself, but I feel we can't not. That there is a war in southern Lebanon, we mentioned this right now, by the Israelis. And there are elements of that same community we were talking about, we've been talking about so far, of Lebanese Christians, and specifically right-wing ones, that are more and more, and this again has ebbs and flows, and sometimes you feel like they want to say more than what they're saying, and other times they restrain themselves and whatnot, are saying things that you can only interpret as either being pro-Israel, or at the very least being like, well, it can't be worse, or maybe that might even be good for us, or whatever it might be. And I'm thinking of one so-called journalist of a few days ago, I don't know her name and it doesn't matter, went on one of the programs, and she said that, like, I consider Syrian refugees in Lebanon to be a greater threat than Israel is. Now, she said that doesn't mean that she's pro-Israel, right? But that's where it gets a bit tricky. That's almost like step one. You're not saying Israel is good. You're saying, actually, it's not the worst. And at some point down the line, once that is established in the context of Lebanon, given that Israel is currently bombing Lebanon, that's kind of step one, in my view. And one possible step two would be to become more and more comfortable saying things like we need to normalize, or we need to, at the very least, be quote-unquote neutral. That's a very big term in those circles, of course, effectively meaning more or less the same thing, not exactly, but more or less. And that's where it gets very, very tricky, of course, and can also have very dark consequences, because this is the same party that did ally with Israel in the 70s and 80s. And under that condition is when the Sabra and Shatila massacre was even possible in the first place. It was under Israeli occupation. The Israelis were controlling the entrance and exits to Sabra and Shatila, and the massacre was committed by the Lebanese forces, or by the Phalangists specifically, but historically the line between those two was more blurry than it is now. Even now it's not entirely rigid. And so, yeah, this is where things can get darker. This is where when we say of the potential for a civil war, and the second one, third, fourth, fifth, depending how you want to count them, this specific issue, this specific tension can be the trigger, or at least is most likely to be the trigger. And the reason I say that, I'll try and I know I kind of went on a different thread, but now I need to explain myself because it can get confusing. The reason I say that is because at some point down the line, once it's established that Israel isn't the problem, or isn't the biggest problem in Lebanon and whatnot, and to be clear, I'm not even saying it's the biggest, I'm saying it is a very big one in Lebanon. What you're also doing is you're telling a segment of the Lebanese population, specifically Shias, and specifically people from the south and from the east and from Dahi, for example, that they're not really Lebanese, that they don't really belong to this national project or whatnot that you have in mind, because you cannot say that the power that is currently bombing them is not a big problem, or is not even as big of a problem as some random working class Syrian refugees, because that same power is not bombing you. And so you're basically saying that as long as they don't bomb me personally, in my family, in my community, in my neighborhoods and whatnot, I don't really care. Which of course speaks to a disconnect of a number of that same community we're talking about from what's happening in especially southern Lebanon. So that's a lot I threw at you, Justin, and I apologize in advance. I'll have your reflections, and we'll see what to do with that. At some point, we'll have to wrap up.
So I think my first response is that I'm going to plug actually the episode that Ayman and I did together on the siege of West Beirut in 1982, which was when the Israelis were occupying and had put the siege down on West Beirut, and the siege ended just a few weeks before the PLO left. The main Palestinian armed factions left Lebanon, and then a few weeks later, the Sabra and Shatila massacre happened. The behavior you're talking about, there's a pretty prominent activist as well who's now outside Lebanon, who kind of tweeted something along those lines of, and I mean, this is somebody who's always, in my opinion, maybe been a bit more of a provocateur, but I don't think this ideology is too remote. It can, as we spoke about, as ideas pick up steam, it can lead to something more dangerous. But somebody saying the only way we can defeat Hezbollah now is through Israeli bombs, so bring them on, sort of thing. Essentially inviting attacks against people that you need to share a national space with, a land with, a national plan with, and not taking into consideration that there are dissidents within these spaces who will suffer. People who are on your side who will suffer. And I think furthermore, it's this idea, it's this misunderstanding that, or a misplaced idea that you will be protected. That the flood will stop before it gets to your door, and not realizing that sometimes this level of fervent violence carries on and continues and wipes you away with it. And I'm talking specifically here about if these comments of preferring the Israelis to like the Israeli attacks to whether it's Syrian refugees or whatever else it may be. There's a number of internal issues, I think, that need serious addressing, including the behavior of the hegemonic nature of the state within a state, of the presence of Hezbollah in that way. But I also think that there's a number of things that need to be dealt with, which would positively impact every person residing in this land that is called Lebanon, right? And that includes refugees and Lebanese citizens, and everyone else in between. So this idea, this what we've seen recently is kind of this turn, this focus on Syrian refugees in particular. There's been, replacement theories kind of thrown around, this thing called demographic threat. These are on the stronger ends. On the weaker ends, there's been, I guess, talk of people saying, you cannot deny that there's too many Syrians. I remember I was in a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we just had this very I guess you could call it progressive talk on gender identity and identification. And then, the conversation kind of came to an end. And then I asked somebody, so are you living in Beirut? And they kind of told me, no, I can't. Like, there's just too many Syrians, and it's not race. It's like, I'm not saying it in a racist way. It's just a fact. Um, and so, I mean, I think that this wider idea is something that needs to be opposed. The fact that there's quote unquote too many. I think what we can say is that this community is has been managed in a way that is a failure for them and is a failure for the Lebanese state and is a failure for Lebanese citizens. They're extremely vulnerable. They're put in places that are extremely vulnerable. They're put in places that put their families in a vulnerable nature. They're put in positions that put Lebanese in vulnerable positions as well. And so to solve any sort of issue, and the issue is not the number, the issue is not the presence in and of itself. The issue is that the state has failed, the leaders have failed, and instead of grasping this failure or uniting in some sort of way to demand accountability or an improvement, there's been kind of an inner division that turns on the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and this kind of brings us back, and I guess we'll end on this topic of like, what do we think might come next, right? I've mentioned the worst case scenario. That's kind of the obvious big headline one. It's a return to the civil war, which for various reasons is unlikely, but might become more likely at some point. I have no idea. I cannot know this. One thing that's missing compared to the 70s, if you want to make a parallel, is a significant source of external funding and, more importantly, armament on a side that's not the Hezbollah. So if Hezbollah has to have a opposing side that's as powerful, it doesn't exist. And so for that reason, especially, a civil war in the classical sense is not that likely, I think. That being said, it doesn't mean that you cannot have like versions of that. It doesn't mean that you can have like pogroms against Syrian refugees, and that might lead to a response by a number of Syrians defending themselves or whatever it might be. And that, one thing can lead to another. And then maybe some prominent member of that community or this community gets killed. And when that happens, of course, things can escalate even faster. So tensions are high, if you want to be very kind of cliche about it using that term. It was a good news to see that the party itself, the Lebanese forces, kind of said calm down. It was good news to see the municipalities involved. At least Bush Hamoud one is one I saw, where you mentioned those black shirts were saying basically forcing or threatening to effectively enact violence against refugees by yesterday, April 12th. The municipality basically came out and say, it's not us and we don't accept this and blah, blah, blah. It's been good to see some pushback. And of course, that's like the big headlines, within Syrian communities themselves, including many friends that I know, there's been a good sense of like, we need to stick together and we need to organize together. And hey, if you need to leave, let me know and I'll try and find you a place, that sort of thing. Doesn't mean that they will find the place. It's not easy, but there is that sense of, community, essentially. And of course, many Lebanese, I suppose, and some friends of mine were also kind of volunteering, their home or whatever it might be. So it's not, I hope it's clear. I think we did a decent enough job in mentioning those nuances. It's not as simple as the Christians or the Shias or the Syrians or the whatnot. It never is, never has been, never will be. It's more that we're talking about tendencies within communities, which, because of the Lebanese sectarian system, which it doesn't have to be this case forever, it just is the case as of now, but because of the political sectarian nature of the Lebanese state and Lebanese economy and Lebanese just political system in general, gets translated in sectarian terms. So you will have a hegemonic narrative within the Christian, the hegemonic narrative within the Shias, and so on and so forth, and all of the nuances in between and beyond and whatnot. So what do we think might come next? I guess I'll throw it at you as the final question of this.
Yeah. So on the civil war thing, you mentioned quite rightly that Hezbollah is the militaristic and arguably political hegemon at the moment, and so there's no one who can adequately challenge them for that position at this point in time. That being said, a couple of years ago, there was a clash, you may remember, at a roundabout in Beirut, where essentially, I believe, Hezbollah and some of their allies were kind of marching through. I think it was a funeral that they were enacting or celebrating, and marching through on a line that had been kind of a dividing line, a famous dividing line during the early days of the Lebanese Civil War. Certain Christian elements saw that as a provocation and engaged and actually shot at, and there was a kind of clash. Luckily, it didn't spiral out of control, but that's just to say that, I think you nailed it, and it's completely true that we don't, there's not a feeling of I guess maybe we can say maybe not as widespread a feeling of like civil war coming, but that doesn't mean there won't be clashes and there won't be expressions of violence to come. What I think is clear is the Syrian community is going to take a number of, or they'll continue to kind of bear the brunt of this in a number of ways. They've been the predominant community that is seeking a sea route to Europe. The leader of Cyprus was recently having meetings with the Lebanese prime minister discussing this, and essentially what seemed to be kind of looking for a sort of deal that might be similar to what Italy and other countries in Europe have done with Tunisia and Libya, to essentially push autocratic means of cracking down. It's kind of like, keep them off our borders. We don't care how you do it, sort of thing, which tends to be quite autocratic and quite vicious. Another thing to note is that many of the Syrians who are caught and returned, Lebanon refuses to accept them. So, for example, if these are people who are in very precarious situations with, vis-a-vis the Syrian regime itself, if they're people who have deserted military service, if they're people who have, for some reason, just angered the regime in any sort of way and then are being returned to regime areas because Lebanon refuses to accept them, or then therefore deports them, which the Lebanese army has and the various Lebanese security forces have done. If this is something that continues to happen, this is really putting Syrians in a very precarious and very dangerous situation. So I think as things come next, this is what we see. I guess we should focus somewhat on something that was positive. Like you said, there was a communal work. Syrians were connecting with each other and helping each other. A number of Lebanese got involved in that, as they always do, and that's one of the beautiful things about here. I'll even say that people who maybe don't have that much sympathy towards the Syrian community, unfortunately, were coming out and saying things like, it's unacceptable that people go around and just start beating up on the poor and on the vulnerable. And so, I guess, the bit of credit that is due there. I think a hope that I maintain is that this is something that, if given enough push and if given enough kind of activism, people will see that this is not an acceptable way of dealing with things, and there are possibilities to unite. There are a number. I'll tell something of a sad but kind of comical story that a researcher told me recently. Some months ago, there was a directive, I guess, that came through some of these, we'll call them black-shirted right-wing Christian guys, that would go around areas and tell Syrians, like, look, you can't be out after 8 p.m. We're applying a curfew on you. One of these Syrian guys used to play cards with, from the story I'm told, he would play cards on a nightly basis with these Lebanese guys. And so the Lebanese guys in these black shirts would go to this Syrian guy. They knocked on his door. They said, hey, listen, don't come down tonight after 8 p.m. They're like, we love you and we know you're good and we know everything. But if we see you on the street, we're going to have to beat you up. So just stay home, um, this shows that there's this wider dynamic. There are interpersonal relationships, and sometimes the guy who's even throwing the punch has a friendship with I'm not trying, and I don't want to paint this as like a rosy sort of like, kumbaya hug. These are problematic and dangerous dynamics. Like, let's be very clear about that. But I think that, like, there are opportunities to connect people, to mobilize. It's not hopeless. And I think we should be fighting for this on various levels, including pushing this idea that reacting this way, taking vigilante justice into our hands against poor and vulnerable communities is not acceptable. Also, redirecting this very real and very legitimate frustration that is existing in the country towards the people who have led the country to the situation where people are suffering, where they're not able to provide for their families, where they don't have work opportunities, where they might work state jobs and get paid very little per month, right? So if there's a space, if there are these spaces to mobilize, to unify, educate, to come together. I think the frustration is there, and I hope that we can start to see more of these sort of like connections coming together, so that a future in this country is different. Lebanon is a small enough country. It's got a ton of baggage. Joy, we've talked about this many times, and interpersonally, I think it leaves you feeling frustrated. It leaves you feeling, at times, feeling angry, frustrated, and at times really feeling hopeless. Like, I want to be honest about that. I don't walk through and just think that things are great. Like, I feel hopeless sometimes, but part of our politics is to find ways to continue. And I think the thing about Lebanon is it's a small enough mass of land or area or country or whatever you want to call it, where a different possibility or a different reality is not only possible, it's potentially achievable. So I guess that would be my hope going forward. I think these coming weeks are going to be really tough for the Syrian community in particular. I mean, let's not ignore the suffering of all working class people in this country, and even people who were formerly middle class, regardless of nationality. Yeah, that's something that we should be vigilantly aware of. But we need to work in these ways to continue to support each other, as the state has failed in that manner. And so this is the place for us to kind of step in and create a new reality, I hope.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent note to end on, actually. So yeah, Justin Salhani, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the Periphery that supports a bunch of media projects, including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.